Magnolia Beaumont sold herself for shelter, standing in the dusty main street of Millbrook, with snow beginning to fall and nothing but a worn carpetbag clutched against her chest. The man before her bore scars that carved deep valleys across the left side of his face, white lines etched by war and weather. His eyes held the same wariness she recognized in her own reflection. "I answered your advertisement because I need a roof over my head before winter kills me," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "If that honesty troubles you, say so now." Ezekiel Thornfield studied her with the careful attention of a man who had learned not to trust first impressions. The townspeople watched from windows and doorways, their disapproval thick as the gathering clouds overhead. He shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking against the frozen ground. "Honesty is more than most offer," he replied. "The ranch is 12 miles north. We can discuss terms there." The wagon ride passed in silence, broken only by the creak of wheels and the steady rhythm of hooves against hardpan earth. Nola kept her gaze fixed on the horizon where mountains rose like broken teeth against a gray sky. The wind carried the scent of coming snow and something else she could not name. Freedom, perhaps, or simply the absence of immediate threat. 3 weeks earlier in San Francisco, she had faced eviction when her employer died and the woman's nephew refused to honor her wages. Mrs. Patterson had been kind in her way, treating Nola with more respect than most, but kindness died with the old woman. Her nephew saw only another expense to eliminate. "She was foolish to pay you so much," he had said, counting coins back into his own pocket. "Find employment elsewhere." Employment elsewhere had proven impossible. The city's opportunities dried up quickly for a woman with her particular circumstances. Winter approached with the inevitability of judgment, and judgment in San Francisco meant the streets or worse. She had found Zeke's advertisement in a discarded newspaper, words that spoke of practical need rather than romantic fantasy. A rancher seeking a wife to help manage his property through the harsh Wyoming winter. He offered shelter and security. In exchange for partnership, nothing more, nothing less. Her letter to him had been equally direct. She possessed skills in household management, basic medicine, and education. She sought protection from the elements and from a world that offered few safe harbors for someone in her position. She made no promises of affection or devotion. Survival required honesty about the terms of exchange. The ranch appeared as the sun touched the western peaks, a collection of weathered buildings huddled against the wind like living things seeking warmth. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight line before the breeze caught it and scattered it across the valley. The place looked solid, permanent, everything she had not possessed for longer than she cared to remember. "The main house," Zeke said, pointing to the largest structure. "You'll have the back room. I keep to the front." Inside, the house reflected its owner's careful nature. Everything had its place and purpose. The furniture showed wear, but also care. Books lined shelves near the fireplace. More books than she had expected from his sparse letters. "Can you read?" he asked, following her gaze. The question stung with its assumptions. "Well enough." "Good. Accounts need keeping." He showed her the kitchen, the pantry stocked with supplies for winter, the room that would be hers. A narrow space with a single window facing east and a bed that looked clean, if not comfortable. She had slept in worse places. Many worse places. "Meals at sunrise and sunset," he said. "I'll handle the livestock. You manage the house and help with record keeping. We present ourselves as properly married when anyone calls. Otherwise, we keep to our own business." She set her carpetbag on the bed and turned to face him. "What about church? Don't attend." "The townspeople seem to have opinions about our arrangement." "Townspeople always have opinions. Most aren't worth the breath spent speaking them." That first week established the rhythm of their careful coexistence. Zeke rose before dawn to tend cattle and horses. Nola managed the household with quiet efficiency, cooking meals that he ate without complaint or praise. They spoke only when necessary, maintaining the polite distance of business partners rather than married couples. But she noticed things. The way he sometimes paused while reading letters before quickly tucking them away. The careful manner in which he avoided showing the scarred side of his face during conversation. The guns he kept clean and ready despite claiming to avoid trouble. Most telling were the nights when she heard him pacing the front room, footsteps crossing back and forth until well past midnight. Something troubled him, beyond the normal concerns of ranch management. Something he chose not to share with his new wife. The isolation suited her in ways she had not expected. No curious neighbors asking uncomfortable questions about her past. No employers making assumptions about her capabilities or character. Just the steady rhythm of necessary work and the growing certainty that winter would not kill her after all. Then Reverend Holcomb arrived on a gray afternoon when the wind carried the promise of serious snow. He sat his horse like a man comfortable with authority, his eyes moving between Nola and Zeke with obvious disapproval. "Came to welcome your bride to our community," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Zeke stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Nola. "Appreciate the gesture." "Unusual circumstances," the Reverend continued. "Folk are talking. Folk talk about everything. Some arrangements cause more talk than others. Some arrangements raise questions about judgment, about fitness for certain responsibilities." The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning. Nola felt the threat beneath them like ice beneath thin snow. Reverend Holcomb's gaze lingered on her face before returning to Zeke. "Just want to make sure everyone understands their place in the community," he said. "And what happens when people forget their place?" After he rode away, Nola found Zeke standing at the window, watching the horizon with the intensity of a man expecting trouble. "What did he mean about fitness for responsibilities?" she asked. Zeke was quiet for a long moment. Snow began falling in earnest, the flakes catching what little light remained of the afternoon. "Means our arrangement has enemies," he said finally. "Means the shelter you sought might not be as secure as either of us hoped." The blizzard came 3 days after the Reverend's visit, sealing them inside the ranch house with walls of wind and snow that turned the world beyond the windows into white nothing. Nola had weathered storms before, but never in a place that felt like it might hold against them. The formal boundaries they had established crumbled under necessity. The kitchen became their shared refuge, the fire their common altar. Zeke moved, his chair closer to the hearth. Nola took to mending his shirts in the same circle of warmth. "You read Latin," he observed on the second day, watching her examine one of his books. "Some. Mrs. Patterson had an extensive library." "She taught you?" "She allowed me to learn." The distinction mattered. Nola had taught herself by candlelight after her duties ended, reading words that opened doors to worlds she could never enter. Knowledge without opportunity, learning without application. Zeke's headaches came with the storm's pressure changes. She watched him press his palm against the scarred side of his skull, jaw tight with pain he refused to acknowledge. On the 3rd day, she heated water and soaked rags and herbs from the kitchen stores. "Sit," she commanded. He obeyed, settling into the chair with the wariness of a man unused to care. She placed the warm compress against his temple, her fingers brushing the ridged flesh where shrapnel had carved its map of violence. His breathing changed, settled. "Helps," he admitted. "War injury? Antietam. Exploding shell took half my unit." The words carried weight beyond their simple facts. She understood about surviving when others did not, about carrying forward when logic suggested surrender. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving the world transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine, unmarked by any passage. They stood at the window together, watching the sun turn the drifts into fields of diamonds. "Beautiful," Nola said. Deadly too. Stock will need hay, paths need clearing. Always the practical concerns. Always the next task requiring attention. She had learned to think the same way. Beauty was a luxury for those who could afford to notice it without counting the cost. The supply run to town came a week later when the roads cleared enough for safe passage. Nola accompanied him, needing to see beyond the ranch's borders, to remember there was a world that continued to turn despite their isolation. Millbrook looked smaller in daylight, meaner, the buildings huddled together, against the cold like conspirators sharing secrets. People watched their wagon pass with the careful attention of those measuring threats. At the general store, Zeke conducted business with efficient silence. Nola examined fabric while listening to conversations that stopped when speakers noticed her presence. She had learned to catch meaning in the spaces between words. Sheriff Morrison leaned against the counter, his voice carrying the authority of brass and steel. Well-dressed fellow came through last week, asking questions about the Thornfield place. Seemed mighty interested in the location. The storekeeper glanced toward Zeke. What kind of questions? Legal kind. About the property. About Zeke's circumstances since the war. Nola felt the words settle like stones in her stomach. She moved closer, pretending interest in ribbons while absorbing every syllable. Expensive horses, Morrison continued. Good. Clothes, city money. Anyone we know claimed to be family. Said he was concerned about Zeke's welfare. Family. The word hung in the air like smoke from a troubled fire. Zeke had never mentioned relatives. Never spoken of anyone who might claim concern for his welfare. The ride home passed in careful silence, but Nola felt the tension radiating from Zeke's shoulders, saw it in the way his hands gripped the reins. Someone was asking questions. Someone with money and authority was taking interest in their arrangement. That night she watched him through the kitchen doorway as he sat at his desk, reading letters by lamplight. His face showed the strain of carrying burdens alone. When he heard her footsteps, he quickly folded the papers and slid them into a drawer. Coffee? She offered. Late for coffee. Early for sleep. He accepted the cup, his fingers brushing. Hers in the exchange. Calloused hands that spoke of honest work and careful maintenance. Hands that had learned to hold things gently because the world broke so much without assistance. Someone was asking about you in town, she said. His stillness told her everything. No surprise. No confusion. Only the resignation of a man who had been expecting trouble and finally seen it arrive. Family, the sheriff said. I have no family. Then someone is lying about their interest in your welfare. Zeke set down the coffee without drinking. Stood and moved to the window where moonlight turned the snow into a map of silver possibilities. The scars on his face caught the light, making them appear freshly carved. Some lies are more dangerous than others, he said. The fever came 2 weeks later, brought on by exhaustion and the constant vigilance required by their situation. Nola collapsed while feeding the chickens, her body finally demanding rest she had been unwilling to grant. Zeke found her in the snow, unconscious but breathing. He carried her inside and placed her in her narrow bed, then sat watch like a sentinel guarding against enemies that could not be fought with conventional weapons. In her delirium, words spilled from her lips unbidden. Fragments of memory and fear that painted pictures of a past she had kept carefully hidden. Marcus promised, she whispered to the darkness. Said he would find me. Said money could buy safety. Zeke leaned closer, catching words that might explain the mystery of her presence in his life. Taught children in Louisiana. Before the war ended. Before everything changed. Her voice carried the weight of loss, of dreams abandoned and hopes redirected toward mere survival. Couldn't stay. Too dangerous. Marcus had plans, but I couldn't wait. She spoke of running. Of fear that drove her west toward uncertainty, rather than east toward promises that might prove empty. of choosing the unknown over the familiar because familiarity had become another word for danger. For 3 days, Zeke tended her with the patience of a man who understood about fighting battles that could not be won through force. He brought broth and water, changed damp cloths on her forehead, listened to secrets she would never have shared in consciousness. When the fever broke, she found him asleep in the chair beside her bed, his hand resting on the cover near her shoulder. The gesture spoke of care that went beyond their business arrangement, of concern that had nothing to do with practical necessity. "How long?" she asked. 3 days. "Thank you." He nodded and stood, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from maintaining vigil. The moment felt fragile, important, like the first crack in ice that would eventually give way to flowing water. "You spoke of someone named Marcus," he said. Carefully, the name fell between them heavy with implication. Nola closed her eyes, feeling the weight of explanation she was not ready to offer. "Someone from before. Someone looking for you, perhaps." More letters arrived that week, delivered by a writer who did not linger for conversation. Zeke's tension increased with each envelope, his midnight pacing becoming a nightly ritual that spoke of problems growing beyond his ability to solve them alone. Nola found herself listening for his footsteps, measuring the rhythm of his worry, against her own growing certainty that their arrangement had become something more complex than either had intended. Shelter was supposed to be simple. Survival was meant to be clean. Instead, she discovered that safety could feel like imprisonment if it came with too many secrets. That protection meant nothing if it was built on foundations that could not bear examination. "Someone's watching us," she said one morning over breakfast. "You're hiding letters, and I heard you talking to yourself about losing everything. If we're partners in this arrangement, I need to know what we're facing." Zeke set down his fork and studied, her face with the intensity of a man making calculations that involved more than simple arithmetic. Outside, the wind carried the sound of approaching hooves. Another visitor, another complication. He reached into his vest and withdrew a letter, placing it on the table between them like a weapon laid down in surrender. "My brother wants me declared incompetent," he said, "and our marriage just gave him the evidence he needed." Coleman Thornfield had been writing letters for 6 months before Nola arrived, each one documenting his brother's declining mental state with the precision of a man building a legal case. Zeke spread the correspondence across the kitchen table, his scarred hands trembling slightly as he revealed the breadth of his brother's campaign. "Claims I'm unfit to manage property," Zeke said. "Says the war damaged more than my face." Nola read through the papers, her teacher's training allowing her to parse the legal language that wrapped threats in formal politeness. Coleman painted his brother as a broken man hiding from society, unable to maintain relationships or make sound decisions. "Your marriage to a woman of questionable background," she read aloud, "demonstrates poor judgment consistent with mental deterioration." The words stung with their calculated cruelty. She was evidence of Zeke's incompetence, proof that trauma had damaged his ability to navigate social expectations. Her presence in his life had become ammunition in a war she had not known they were fighting. "He wants the ranch," Zeke continued. "Always did. Uncle left it to me instead of him." "Why?" "Coleman sees land as investment. I see it as home." The distinction mattered in ways that went beyond sentiment. Coleman lived in Denver, building wealth through speculation and influence. He moved in circles where property was currency and relationships were transactions measured in profit and loss. "He can have me declared incompetent and committed," Zeke said. "State asylum. Legal guardianship transfers to next of kin." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Remove the inconvenient brother, claim the valuable property, sell to the highest bidder without concern for consequences beyond immediate gain. "The railroad wants this valley," Zeke added. Coleman's been negotiating. Pieces fell into place. With the inevitability of winter following autumn, the well-dressed stranger asking questions, the interest in Zeke's circumstances, the careful documentation of behavior that could be interpreted as unstable. So you needed a wife, Nola said. Someone to make you appear normal. I needed help, you needed shelter. Seemed honest enough. Honest but incomplete. They had made their bargain without understanding its full implications. Two desperate people grasping for safety in a world designed to deny them both. The next. Letters were worse. Coleman had hired investigators to document Zeke's isolation, his failure to attend church, his avoidance of social functions. The marriage to Nola was presented as the final proof of diminished capacity, evidence that trauma had destroyed his judgment. What does he know about me? Nola asked. Zeke pulled out a folder thick with papers. Coleman's investigators had been thorough. They knew about her employment in San Francisco, her employer's death, her desperate circumstances. They had traced her origins to Louisiana, uncovered fragments of her past that she had hoped to leave buried. Says here you were engaged before, Zeke said quietly. Marcus Washington, good man, ambitious. Why didn't you marry him? The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither was ready to explore. Nola stood and moved to the window, where mountains rose sharp against the evening sky. Distance had always been her answer to difficult questions. He had plans that required time. I had needs that required immediate solutions. So you came here. So I came here. That night, they worked by lamplight, organizing documents and correspondence into patterns that might reveal weaknesses in Coleman's strategy. Nola's education proved valuable, her ability to read legal language matching Zeke's knowledge of property law. He's bribing officials, she discovered. Look at these dates. Every payment coincides with a favorable ruling in similar cases. Judge Morrison's been handling competency hearings for 5 years, Zeke confirmed. Coleman's been contributing to his campaign fund. Corruption was not unusual in territorial politics, but proving it required evidence that could survive legal challenge. They needed documentation that went beyond circumstantial connections, proof that could expose the conspiracy before it destroyed them. The work brought them closer together, shared purpose creating intimacy that their formal arrangement had not allowed. They moved around each other. In the small kitchen with growing familiarity, passing papers and coffee with the ease of long partnership. You were a teacher, Zeke observed, watching her organize documents into logical categories. Wanted to be. War ended before I could establish a proper school. You could teach here. Town needs a schoolmarm. The suggestion carried weight beyond practical consideration. Teaching would give her standing in the community, respectability that might counter Coleman's characterization of her as evidence of Zeke's poor judgment. Townspeople might not accept students learning from someone in my position. Their children need education more than they need prejudice. The conversation revealed changes in both of them, growth that had occurred beneath the surface of their careful coexistence. Zeke was thinking beyond mere survival, considering futures that extended past the immediate threat. Nola was allowing herself to imagine belonging somewhere, putting down roots in soil that might actually sustain them. Days blended into a rhythm of investigation and preparation. They discovered that Coleman's reach extended beyond legal manipulation into areas that bordered on criminal conspiracy. The railroad deal involved displaced families, bribed officials, and environmental destruction that would devastate the valley. He's not just stealing from you, Nola realized. He's stealing from everyone who lives here. The knowledge transformed their private battle into something larger, a fight for community survival against outside exploitation. Other ranchers would lose their land. The town would be destroyed to make way for rail yards and commercial development. We need allies, she said. Hard to find when people question the marriage. Then we give them bigger problems to worry about. Their strategy took shape slowly. built on the foundation of shared purpose and growing trust. They would expose Coleman's corruption while demonstrating their own competence, turning his weapons against him while building support from unexpected sources. The personal cost of their collaboration was harder to measure. Working closely together, sharing meals and conversation, they began to see beyond the careful boundaries of their original arrangement. Respect grew into something warmer. Mutual protection evolved into genuine care. Nola found herself studying Zeke's face when he was absorbed in reading, noting the intelligence in his eyes and the gentleness of his hands when he handled fragile documents. The scars that had initially marked him as damage began to seem like evidence of survival, proof of strength rather than weakness. Zeke watched her move through the house with growing appreciation for her quick mind and steady resolve. She brought order to chaos, purpose to confusion. Her presence had transformed his isolated existence into something that felt almost like home. Neither spoke of these changes directly. The situation was too fragile, their positions too precarious for declarations that might complicate their alliance. But awareness grew between them, acknowledgement of connections that went beyond mutual necessity. 2 weeks into their investigation, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge, sitting his horse with the patience of a man accustomed to long journeys. He watched the ranch through field glasses before riding closer, his approach careful but direct. Nola saw him first, her heart stopping as she recognized the straight posture and careful horsemanship that had once represented safety and promise. Marcus Washington had found her, arriving just as she was beginning to believe that shelter might become something more permanent than mere survival. He rode into the yard with the confidence of a man who had prospered since their separation, his clothes fine, his horse expensive. Success sat on his shoulders easily, the kind of achievement that opened doors and commanded respect. "Hello, Magnolia," he said, using the name she had carried before desperation forced her to accept diminished circumstances. Zeke emerged from the barn, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who recognized significant change when it appeared in his yard. The stranger's bearing marked him as important, someone whose presence would shift the balance of everything they had been building. "Marcus," Nola replied, the word carrying years of history and unfinished conversation. "I've been looking for you for a long time," Marcus said, his eyes moving between Nola and Zeke with careful attention to detail. "I think we need to talk." Marcus Washington had built an empire from nothing, his success evident in every detail from his tailored coat to the gold watch chain glinting against his vest. He sat at Nola's kitchen table speaking of opportunities that stretched beyond Wyoming's harsh boundaries into a world where respect could be earned and maintained. "I own 3 businesses in San Francisco," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "Freight company, restaurant, boarding house for travelers. All legitimate, all profitable." Nola poured coffee with hands that remained steady despite the storm of memory his presence had awakened. She had loved this man once, before war scattered their plans across a landscape that no longer existed. "You've done well for yourself, well enough to offer you the life we planned. The life you deserve." Zeke sat silent in the corner, his scarred face unreadable. He listened to Marcus paint pictures of a future built on solid ground, free from the uncertainties that plagued their current existence. Marcus had searched for her through networks of former slaves who had scattered west after emancipation, following rumors and fragments of information across hundreds of miles. His persistence spoke of devotion that had survived separation and silence. "I have a house on Nob Hill," Marcus continued. "Respectable neighborhood. You could teach there, open your own school. Parents would pay good money for proper education." The offer was everything Nola had once dreamed of possessing: security without compromise, respectability without the constant vigilance their current arrangement required, a place in a community that would value her contributions rather than question her presence. "What about here?" she asked. "What about here?" You're living in isolation with a man you barely know, fighting battles that aren't yours to fight. Marcus glanced toward Zeke, measuring him with the careful attention of someone accustomed to evaluating potential threats. He saw the scars, the isolation, the circumstances that had brought them together. You sold yourself for shelter, Marcus said gently. I'm offering to buy you back. The words struck like stones thrown against glass, shattering the careful peace they had built through weeks of shared purpose. Nola felt heat rise in her cheeks, anger and shame mixing into something that tasted of copper and regret. I made my own choices. You made survival choices. I'm offering you the chance to choose happiness. That evening, after Marcus had retired, to the guest room, Nola found Zeke standing in the barn among horses that nickered softly in their stalls. He was brushing his mare with the methodical attention of a man who needed his hands occupied, while his mind worked through problems that had no clean solutions. He's right, Zeke said without looking up from his work. He can give you everything you deserve. And what do I deserve? More than a broken man and a fight that might destroy us both. The admission hung between them heavy with unspoken truths. Their arrangement had begun as mutual exploitation, two desperate people using each other for survival. Somewhere in the sharing of secrets and the building of trust, exploitation had transformed into something neither had expected to find. What if I don't want more? She asked. What if what we have is enough? Zeke's hands stilled on the brush. He turned to face her, his scarred features catching lamplight that turned shadows into valleys of remembered pain. Then you're a fool, and I won't let you be a fool for my sake. Marcus spent 3 days at the ranch, observing their partnership, with the sharp attention of a businessman evaluating an investment. He saw the efficiency of their collaboration, the careful way they moved around each other in the small spaces of daily life. He also saw the things they tried to hide. The way Nola's eyes followed Zeke's movements. The protective stance Zeke adopted when strangers approached. The intimacy that had grown between them, despite their protestations of mere partnership. You love him, Marcus said on his final morning, the words delivered without accusation or judgment. Nola was kneading bread, her hands working the dough with more force than necessary. I respect him. Respect doesn't make a woman look at a man the way you look at him. How do I look at him? The way you used to look at me. The comparison cut deep because it carried truth she had been unwilling to acknowledge. Her feelings for Zeke had grown beyond gratitude or partnership into something that felt dangerously close to devotion. He doesn't love me, she said. He's trying not to. There's a difference. Marcus had brought papers with him, legal documents that would formalize their reunion and business arrangements that would secure her future. All she had to do was sign her name and accept the life he was offering. I won't wait forever, he said. I waited 3 years to find you. I can't wait 3 more for you to decide if you want to be found. That night Zeke withdrew to his room early, leaving Nola to consider choices that would shape the rest of her life. She could choose safety with Marcus, respectability in a community that would value her contributions. Or she could choose uncertainty with Zeke, love that had grown from desperation but felt more real than anything she had previously experienced. The decision was complicated by Marcus's investigation into Coleman's activities. His business connections in Denver had revealed the full scope of the railroad conspiracy, corruption that extended into territorial government and federal land offices. Your brother has been bribing officials for 2 years, Marcus told them. Judge Morrison's been ruling in favor of railroad interests in every case that's come before him. The evidence Marcus had gathered could destroy Coleman's legal case. But it came with conditions that made acceptance complicated. Marcus would share his information if Nola agreed to return with him to San Francisco. Her freedom in exchange for Zeke's salvation. I won't be the price of your rescue, she told Zeke. And I won't be the reason you give up your future. They were at an impasse built on mutual sacrifice, each willing to surrender happiness for the other's benefit. The nobility of their positions made resolution impossible through conventional means. Coleman's arrival ended their debate with the finality of winter storms that reshape landscapes whether inhabitants consent or not. He came with legal papers and hired men, his authority backed by corrupt judges and purchased verdicts. Marcus watched the approaching riders through field glasses, counting weapons and measuring odds with the practical assessment of someone who had survived difficult circumstances through careful planning. 12 men, he reported, armed but not looking for a fight. They want this to appear legal. Coleman rode directly to the house, his bearing confident as a man who believed law and custom were on his side. He dismounted and approached the door with papers already drawn, ready to serve notice of proceedings that would strip Zeke of property and freedom. "Ezekiel Thornfield," he called out, "I have a court order requiring your appearance before Judge Morrison." Nola stood beside Zeke on the porch, their partnership made visible in their united front against external threat. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe without appearing to interfere, his presence a wild card in calculations that had not accounted for additional players. "On what charges?" Zeke asked. "Mental incompetence, inability to manage property or make sound decisions regarding your welfare." Coleman's eyes moved to Nola, his expression making clear that her presence was evidence supporting his case. Their marriage was proof of diminished capacity, their partnership confirmation of judgment damaged beyond repair. "The court has appointed me as temporary guardian pending psychiatric evaluation," Coleman continued. "You'll be transported to the Territorial Hospital for assessment." The trap was closing with mechanical precision, legal machinery grinding forward regardless of truth or justice. Nola felt panic rise in her throat, the familiar taste of powerlessness that had driven her west in search of sanctuary. Marcus stepped forward, his movement drawing attention from all parties. He held papers of his own, documents that carried the weight of connections Coleman had not anticipated. "I think you'll find those orders have been superseded," Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man holding superior cards. "Federal marshal's been investigating territorial corruption. Judge Morrison's been suspended pending review of his recent decisions." Coleman's confidence cracked for the first time, uncertainty replacing the assurance that had carried him across hundreds of miles to claim his prize. "Who are you?" Coleman demanded. "Marcus Washington. I represent certain business interests concerned about railroad corruption in territorial land deals." The balance of power shifted like sand beneath their feet. Coleman's legal weapons had been neutralized by forces he had not known existed. His carefully constructed case collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Coleman Thornfield's hired men shifted uneasily in their saddles as Marcus Washington produced documents that carried federal authority. The carefully orchestrated legal seizure was dissolving into something more dangerous, a confrontation between opposing forces where the rules had suddenly changed. "Federal investigation supersedes territorial court orders," Marcus continued, his voice cutting through the mountain air with the precision of sharpened steel. "Judge Morrison's authority has been suspended. Your guardianship papers are worthless." Coleman studied the documents with the desperate attention of a man watching his fortune slip away. He had invested months and considerable money in bribing officials, building legal frameworks that would give him control of the ranch. Federal intervention had not been part of his calculations. "This doesn't end here," Coleman said, his composure cracking to reveal the ruthless ambition beneath his polished exterior. "I have other resources, other methods." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dangerous fire. Coleman's hired men were not lawyers or court officers. They were men accustomed to solving problems through intimidation and force when legal methods proved insufficient. "Leave," Zeke said, his hand resting on the rifle he kept near the door. "Take your men and your threats with you. I'll be back with proper authority. You'll be back with nothing." Federal marshals are already investigating your railroad deals. Your corruption extends beyond my ranch into dozens of fraudulent land transactions. Marcus had been thorough in his research, uncovering connections that reached from territorial courts to federal land offices. Coleman's network of bribed officials was being systematically exposed and dismantled. The writers departed with reluctant, backward glances, their employer's confidence shattered, but not his determination. Coleman had too much invested in the railroad scheme to abandon it without a fight. He would return with different tactics, methods that did not depend on corrupt judges or legal manipulation. That evening, Nola and Marcus sat on the porch watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire and gold. The immediate crisis had passed, but larger questions remained unresolved between them. "You could still come with me," Marcus said. "Federal protection will only last so long. Coleman has resources beyond what we've seen. And leave Zeke to face whatever comes next alone? He's a grown man. He knew the risks when he placed that advertisement." The practical assessment stung because it carried truth. Zeke had indeed known the dangers of his situation when he sought a mail-order bride. He had used her presence to appear more stable, more capable of managing his affairs responsibly. "I used him too," Nola admitted. "I sold myself for shelter, just like I said. But somewhere along the way, it became something else." She could not deny the transformation that had occurred between them. What began as mutual exploitation had grown into partnership, respect, and something deeper that neither had expected to find in their desperate circumstances. "He doesn't believe he deserves love," she said. "And you don't believe you deserve respect." Marcus understood the wounds that drove them both toward arrangements that promised safety, without requiring the vulnerability that love demanded. They envied both toward arrangements that promised safety, without requiring the vulnerability that love demanded. Were both survivors who had learned to expect disappointment from hope. Inside the house, Zeke organized papers and weapons with the methodical preparation of a man expecting siege. Coleman would return with different strategies, approaches that bypassed legal channels in favor of more direct methods. "He'll try to burn us out," Zeke predicted, "or poison the water. Something that looks accidental but serves his purposes. The townspeople won't stand for open violence. Townspeople will believe what they want to believe, especially if the alternative is admitting they've been fools." The harsh assessment reflected Zeke's understanding of community dynamics in isolated territories where survival often required willful blindness to uncomfortable truths. People would accept reasonable explanations rather than face evidence of systematic corruption. Marcus joined their planning session, bringing resources and connections that expanded their options beyond mere defensive measures. His business network included contacts in law enforcement, politics, and finance who could apply pressure on Coleman's operations. "The railroad consortium is already nervous about federal investigation," Marcus reported. "They're distancing themselves from Coleman's methods, leaving him isolated. Desperate men make dangerous choices." The warning proved prophetic. Coleman returned 3 days later, not with legal papers, but with fire. The barn burned first, flames racing through dry hay and wooden walls with the hunger of something that had been carefully fed and strategically placed. Zeke and Marcus fought the blaze while Nola organized supplies and tended horses driven mad by smoke and terror. The structure could not be saved, but they managed to prevent the fire from spreading to other buildings. Accident, Coleman would claim if questioned. Barns burned regularly in harsh climates where dry materials and careless sparks created constant danger. The timing would be suspicious but not legally actionable. 2 nights later, the well was poisoned. Livestock began dying with symptoms that spoke of deliberate contamination rather than natural causes. The ranch's water supply, carefully maintained through seasons of drought and abundance, had been turned into an instrument of destruction. "He's trying to make the place uninhabitable," Nola realized. Force us to abandon it voluntarily, or die trying to hold it. Coleman's strategy was elegant in its cruelty. He could not take the ranch through legal channels, so he was making it impossible to keep. Each attack was deniable, attributable to the harsh realities of frontier life rather than malicious intent. The campaign escalated with systematic destruction of fences, theft of livestock, and contamination of feed supplies. Coleman's men worked under cover of darkness, striking at the infrastructure that made ranching possible in the unforgiving landscape. "We need help," Marcus said after the fourth night of attacks. "This isn't something 3 people can handle alone. Townspeople won't get involved in what they see as family business. Then we make it everyone's business." The town meeting convened in the church, the only building large enough to hold the gathering Marcus had organized. He had spent the week visiting every ranch and business within 50 miles, sharing evidence of Coleman's railroad scheme and its implications for the entire valley. "Your land is next," Marcus told the assembled ranchers. "Coleman needs the entire valley for the railroad junction. What's happening to Zeke Thornfield is happening to all of you." Maps and documents spread across tables showed the scope of Coleman's ambitions. The railroad development would displace dozens of families, destroy established communities, and strip the valley of resources that had sustained generations of settlers. Federal investigation has already identified forged deeds, bribed officials, and fraudulent land claims, Marcus continued. Coleman's corruption extends far beyond one ranch. Sheriff Morrison stood to address the crowd, his authority diminished but not eliminated by recent revelations about judicial corruption. "What exactly are you asking us to do?" "Stand together against outside exploitation. Protect your community from forces that see you as obstacles to profit." The appeal succeeded because it transformed individual grievances into collective resistance. Coleman had overreached, threatening too many people with his ambitious schemes. His methods had created enemies where patience might have found allies. "We'll post guards," announced Thomas Brennan, whose ranch bordered Zeke's property. "Take turns watching for trouble." "Organize patrols," added Sarah McKenna, the widow who ran the town's boarding house. "Make sure everyone knows we're paying attention." Community defense took shape through shared responsibility and mutual protection. Coleman's attacks had united his opposition, creating the very resistance his secretive methods were meant to avoid. Nola watched the proceedings with amazement at how quickly isolation could transform into belonging when circumstances demanded cooperation. The same people who had questioned her marriage to Zeke were now treating her as a valued member of their community. "You've given them something to fight for," Marcus observed, "something bigger than individual survival. We've given them the truth. Sometimes that's enough." Coleman's final assault came not through fire or poison, but through a direct attack on the ranch house itself. He arrived with professional gunmen, men whose services extended beyond intimidation into areas that crossed legal boundaries without hesitation. The battle for the ranch became a battle for the future of the valley, with consequences that would determine whether communities could resist exploitation or would be consumed by forces that measured everything in profit and loss. Coleman arrived at dawn with 8 hired guns, men whose faces carried the careful blankness of those who made their living through intimidation and worse. They spread across the ranch yard with professional efficiency, cutting off escape routes while maintaining the pretense of legal authority. "Last chance, brother," Coleman called from horseback, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "Come quietly, and this ends without bloodshed." Zeke emerged from the house with Nola beside him, their unity a silent declaration that whatever came next would be faced together. Marcus positioned himself near the barn, his presence a reminder that Coleman's actions were being witnessed by someone with connections beyond the valley. "The only thing ending is your scheme," Zeke replied. "Federal marshals are already investigating your railroad corruption." "Federal marshals are far away. We're here now." The town bell began ringing, its bronze voice carrying across the valley. with the urgency of fire or flood. Community members who had agreed to mutual defense were responding to the signal, abandoning their morning routines to honor commitments made in the church meeting. Coleman's confidence wavered as riders appeared on the surrounding ridges. Thomas Brennan led a group from the eastern ranches. Sarah McKenna brought townspeople armed with hunting rifles and righteous anger. Sheriff Morrison arrived with his deputies, their loyalty finally clarified by evidence of federal corruption. "You're outnumbered," Marcus observed with quiet satisfaction. "This is still family business," Coleman insisted, but his hired guns were eyeing the growing crowd with professional concern. They had been paid to intimidate isolated victims, not to fight a war against an entire community. The confrontation shifted from violence to testimony as townspeople demanded answers about the railroad scheme. Documents were produced, evidence presented, corruption exposed in the harsh light of mountain morning. Coleman's carefully constructed legal framework crumbled under scrutiny it had never been designed to withstand. "Judge Morrison took bribes," Sarah McKenna declared, reading from papers Marcus had provided. Every competency hearing was fixed in advance. "Land deeds were forged," Thomas Brennan added. "Coleman's been stealing property for 2 years. The crowd's anger focused on Coleman with the intensity of people who had discovered they were being systematically robbed. His hired guns began backing toward their horses, recognizing that their employer's position had become untenable. "You have no proof," Coleman protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Federal investigators have all the proof they need," Marcus replied. "Bank records, correspondence, witness testimony. Your corruption extends from here to Denver." "Sheriff." Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs, his authority restored by community support and federal backing. "Coleman Thornfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted theft of federal lands." The anticlimactic end to months of terror felt almost disappointing in its simplicity. Coleman's grand scheme collapsed not through dramatic violence but through patient investigation and community resistance. His hired guns departed without firing a shot, their services no longer required or wanted. Nola watched Coleman being led away and felt something release inside her chest, a tension she had carried since arriving in Wyoming. The threat that had shadowed their marriage was finally eliminated, leaving space for whatever they might choose to build together. "It's over," Zeke said, his scarred face showing relief and something deeper. "This part is over," she corrected. "What comes next is up to us." Marcus prepared to leave that afternoon, his business in Wyoming concluded. The railroad scheme was exposed, Coleman was in custody, and federal authorities were cleaning up the corruption that had enabled the conspiracy. His duty was complete. "You could still come with me," he offered one final time. "My place is here." "With him?" "With the life we're building together." Marcus nodded with the acceptance of a man who had found his answer, even if it was not the one he had hoped to receive. "He's lucky to have you. We're lucky to have each other." The distinction mattered. Their relationship had grown beyond the desperate arrangement that brought them together into something that resembled the partnership she had observed in her parents' generation. Mutual respect, shared burdens, love that had been earned through trial rather than declared through passion. 6 months later, the ranch showed signs of recovery and growth. The barn had been rebuilt with help from neighbors who no longer questioned Nola's place in the community. The well had been cleaned and restored. Livestock grazed in pastures where fences stood straight and strong. Nola's school opened in the town's unused Methodist church, serving children whose parents had decided that education mattered more than prejudice. Her teaching skills, refined through years of private study and practical application, proved exactly what the community needed. 23 students, she reported to Zeke over dinner, including the Morrison twins and Sarah McKenna's granddaughter. Town's changing. People change when they're given the chance. The transformation was visible in small details. Neighbors who had once averted their eyes now offered greetings. Children who had stared with curiosity now approached with questions about lessons and books. Acceptance had been earned through service and proven through crisis. Zeke's own healing was evident in his willingness to participate in community events. His scars no longer a source of shame, but simply part of his history. The war had marked him, but it had not defined him. Love had provided the context for understanding that survival was only the beginning of recovery. Their marriage had evolved from transaction to partnership to something that felt like the foundation for a future neither had dared to imagine when desperation first brought them together. They worked the ranch as a team, managed the household as equals, and faced the future as people who had learned to trust in possibilities beyond mere survival. "I sold myself for shelter," Nola said one evening as they watched sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. "And I gave you everything I had," Zeke replied. "Seems like a fair trade." "More than fair, you gave me a home." The word carried weight that went beyond physical structures or legal arrangements. Home was what they had built together through shared struggles and mutual support. Home was the safety they had created for each other in a world that offered little sanctuary for people in their circumstances. Marcus visited twice a year, bringing news from San Francisco and maintaining the friendship that had grown from their shared commitment to justice. His business continued to prosper, his success serving as proof that former slaves could build wealth and respectability in territories where opportunity existed for those bold enough to seize it. "Any regrets?" he asked during his spring visit, watching Nola work in the garden she had planted behind the house. "About choosing love over security?" "None. Even when security was guaranteed and love was just a possibility? Especially then. Security without love is just another kind of prison." The garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers that would never have grown in San Francisco's climate, testament to the advantages of choosing the uncertain over the safe. Some risks were worth taking when the potential rewards included freedom to become whatever circumstances would allow. Their story became part of the valley's history, a reminder that love could grow from the most unlikely soil when tended with patience and watered with truth. They had proved that arrangements made from desperation could transform into partnerships built on respect and maintained through mutual devotion. The ranch prospered under their joint management. The school educated children who would carry forward the lessons learned from teachers who had overcome their own limitations. The community that had initially questioned their marriage eventually celebrated it as proof that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. Nola had indeed sold herself for shelter, but she had received far more than she had bargained for. She had found love that asked nothing except honesty, partnership that demanded everything except surrender of self, and belonging that had been earned through service rather than granted through circumstance. The scarred rancher had given her love she never dared to dream, and she had given him something equally precious in return. The gift of being seen completely and accepted unconditionally, scars and all. And that is all to the story for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.